Last time we looked at the schism between artist and audience, specifically in the Austro-German world, specifically in Vienna. This time we're going to look at Paris. Same time, although we're going to back up just a little bit before where we were. We're going to look at the late 1800s and then run up into the very beginning of the 1900s. But Paris, France, it's a different place. It's a different culture, different people, different sounds come out of that. I do want to revisit, last time we were talking about Arnold Schoenberg as sort of the flag bearer for the uglification of music, and I could get in some trouble with that. I didn't mean to put a judgment on that, but 20th century classical music gets difficult, and Schoenberg, as sort of the torchbearer for 12-tone music, sort of becomes the flag bearer for that. He was not the first composer to write atonal music, though, and if we're defining that as music outside of the major and minor key system, that distinction probably belongs to the great pianist and composer Franz Liszt, and I wanted to mention that. He was kind of like a rock star of the late Romantic age. Liszt's harmonies began to become unmoored from traditional music theory as it was understood at the time. His friend Richard Wagner, who we've talked a lot about, he muttered to his wife Cosima that his old friend Liszt was showing signs of quote-unquote budding insanity. But this wasn't an isolated occurrence. Composers in different areas were starting to experiment with new harmonies as if there was something natural about this course. Atonal experimentations cropped up in Russia and in France as well. Alex Ross writes in The Rest is Noise that, quote, the fabric of harmony was warping as if under the influence of an unseen force, end quote. And we're going to go take a closer look at what was going on in France in the lead up to the same time period. We have to understand that Paris was probably the center of the avant-garde as we now conceive that. There was a great interest in all things mystical. There was a connection between the arts and the mystical. The French symbolist poet Stéphane Mallarmé described poetry this way, saying, quote, everything that is sacred and that wishes to remain so must envelop itself in mystery, end quote. This was the kind of rhetoric that artists were applying to their craft. Claude Debussy, the great French composer, took this to heart, saying to his colleague Ernest Chausson in 1893 that music really ought to be a hermetical science, enshrined in texts so hard and laborious to decipher as to discourage the herd of people who treat it as casually as they do a handkerchief. I go further, said Debussy, and instead of spreading music among the populace, I propose the foundation of a society of musical esotericism, end quote. So the idea of something hermetical, it means sealed, to seal it away. And to make something esoteric, it's kind of the same idea. You make it too complicated to decipher. So he's talking about sealing musical arts away from the general public. And that is, to me, so reminiscent of Arnold Schoenberg's quote from our last episode, where he said, if it is art, it is not for all. And if it is for all, it is not art. Though I do think Schoenberg's is a little bit more pessimistic. Basically saying art is not for the people. Debussy, to me, feels like he's saying a little bit more, let's maintain the magic. Let's continue to enshrine it in this mysticism to keep its vibrance. But regardless, there are these parallels in that sentiment, but it plays out very differently in France than it does in Germany and Austria. And I want to start looking at this musical evolution with those two different centers in mind. Claude Debussy is a great character. He was born the son of a shopkeeper in 1862. He studied at the Paris Conservatory, but his ideas were really too ahead of his time. He struggled for years to write a cantata sufficiently dull enough to win the Prix de Rome. That's the great music competition of the age, the Rome Prize. But he did win it in 1884, which did establish him as one of the names in the classical canon. In his spare time, though, Debussy was all over the avant-garde scene in Paris. He frequented bookstores stocked with occult and oriental lore. He went to Bayreuth in 1888 and 1889, and there he fell under the spell of Richard Wagner's operas, specifically Parsifal, which are full of occult lore. He attended elite weekly gatherings with the poet Mallarmé and delved into more obscure regions as well, cultish Catholic societies such as the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross. So he was a Rosicrucian. if you've read Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, that listed Claude Debussy as the 33rd Grandmaster of the Prieur de Zion, which legend had it guarded the secret of the Holy Grail. Debussy probably was not really protecting the Holy Grail, but anyway, he was into these mystical pursuits. But so were a lot of artists at the time, following in the footsteps of Richard Wagner's mystical-themed operas. It was really quite popular. Debussy also immersed himself in painting and poetry, working out musical analogies for his aesthetic impressions. He was later labeled a musical impressionist, sort of like Renoir and Monet are impressionist painters. Debussy is considered an impressionist composer, but that term came later, and Debussy really was not influenced during his life by Renoir and Monet. He was more influenced by Anglo-American painters, the way Turner suffused landscapes with light, by Whistler's way of creating mood with a seascape. He read the poetry of Paul Verlaine. Paul Verlaine's imagery is simple and elusive. The color of moonlight, the music of rustling leaves and falling rain, the unreadable beauty of the sea, the motion of ancient dances, the souls of marionettes. All these things fired Debussy's musical imagination. And then, in 1889, he attended the Paris Universal Exposition. That's the World's Fair. And France was among the European countries involved in mass world colonization, and as such they were showcasing some of the arts found in their colonies at the World's Fair. That's where Gauguin first encountered the tropical life that led him to then live in Tahiti and make his famous paintings. It was here that Debussy heard music from Eastern Asia. He saw a Vietnamese theater troupe which used resonating gongs for music, and he was transfixed. And he heard a Javanese gamelan ensemble which used quasi-minimalistic pentatonic scales stacked delicately with these repetitive textures. And it was one of these life-changing events for him. Those textures and sounds opened him up for all kinds of textures and timbres and harmonies that he used in his own composition. Let's talk for just a second about physics of sound. For a really long time, I mean like a really, really long time, humans have written about pairs of notes that either went well together or didn't go well together, like consonance and dissonance. Back on cuneiform tablets found in the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, there was reference to pairs of notes labeled clear or unclear. So again, consonance, dissonance. This concept is tied to the physics of sound, and we see those principles spilling out in the overtone series, which we hear in Strauss's Thus Spake Zarathustra, and so on. Debussy started experimenting with the whole tone scale, meaning that there's a whole step between each note in the scale, and this is a fascinating mix of clear and unclear harmonies. It's full of these bright major thirds, but it also has tritones. Remember the tritone is the interval that used to be called the devil's chord because of its inherent tension. Debussy also made use of pentatonic scales, which he encountered in that gamelan music at the World's Fair, and he was aware of the physics of sound and probably studied the music theory treatise of Hermann von Helmholtz that outlined the properties of the overtone series, and those properties seem to be showcased in a lot of Debussy's work. He uses octaves and fifths in his lower voices, and then these tightly packed, shimmering close intervals on the higher register, so big space down here, and then these tightly packed intervals, and that mirrors our overtone series, making use of the physics of sound. I mentioned that Debussy was doing a fair amount of mystical questing in the 1800s. By 1900, he had cooled off a little bit. He's a human being. He changes his outlook a little bit. He was still going to meetings of these esoteric societies, but instead of calling for a society of musical esotericism, he instead seemed to be a champion at this point of classic French values, things like clarity and elegance and grace. He was also listening to the rich mix of different sounds that one might encounter in Parisian cafes and cabarets, and then also at the opera. The sounds of Spanish flamenco, with its Moorish influence and Arabic scales, started to seep into his audio world. Paris was a world where one could drift easily between the world of occult esotericism and then the populism of the cabaret scene, so popular music and esoteric music, like right on top of each other. I mean like literally right on top of each other. The Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross, where Debussy was a member, it was directly upstairs from the famous cabaret Auberge du Clos. So just imagine Debussy is upstairs debating arcane philosophy with poets and other members, and the tunes of the cafe concerts are drifting up from below. I mean, like, what a scene. Claude Debussy knew Erik Satie from this same social circle. Satie was a Rosicrucian as well, and actually served for a while as house composer for the Order of the Rose Cross of the Temple and Grail. Satie's father was a publisher of music hall and cabaret songs. So Erik Satie grew up surrounded by the popular music of his day. So when he took to composition, even though the stuff he was writing was experimental and new in its own way, it was also striking in its simplicity and drew on some of that popular music. Erik Satie was the composer of the Gymnopédies, and those were really remarkable in that way, where they were strikingly simplistic and yet from the classical canon. The first 18 measures of the first Gymnopédie only uses 6 notes. There's no development, there's no transition, only what Alex Ross describes as an instant prolonged. There's a great quote by conductor Reinbert Deleu, who wrote that Erik Satie was, in a manner of speaking, starting European musical history all over again, end quote. He's kind of stripping it down and rebuilding it. And in a lot of ways, that's what Debussy was doing too. Later in these videos that I'm making, we're going to talk about the idea of minimalism. In 1901, Debussy made a remark to his colleague Paul Dukas. Paul Dukas wrote the music to Sorcerer's Apprentice, that too many modern works had become needlessly complex, that they smell of the lamp, not of the sun. They smell of the lamp, not of the sun. I love that quote. What an image. It captures really nicely this vision of an alternative modernism, this kind of bohemian French writing, drawing on a confluence of cultures and the liveliness of the cabaret scene. And this is heading toward maturity in the folk-based, jazzy, machine-driven music of the 1920s, which really comes sweeping in with the Roaring 20s, right? That's what it calls post-World War I. That's where we're headed. And World War I is going to become a big part of this story soon. But it's avant-garde. It was new. And it played out totally differently than what was happening back in Austria. Effectively, there were 2 simultaneous avant-gardes happening. And the one shaking out in Vienna, led at this point by the work of Arnold Schoenberg, that was going in a different direction. If we think of the music of France being somehow of the people, of the sun, think about the cafes and the cabarets. The classical music of Vienna was certainly of the lamp. It was intellectual, it was heady, it had also greater potential to alienate its listeners. So we have these 2 musical worlds. We have the same time period, we have a lot of the same political issues bubbling, but the cultures are different, and the way that the cultures interact with music is different and affects the development of music differently in ways that speak of the cultures it comes from. We're going to next time go deeper and look more closely at the life and work of Arnold Schoenberg to get a better understanding of this music of the lamp and what that looks like. Stay tuned.